Okay, tonight's featured reader is Maxine Scates. Maxine's most recent book, My Wilderness, was published by the University of Pittsburgh Press in 2021. She's the author of 3 previous collections of poetry, Undone, Black Loam, and Toluca Street. Her poems have been widely published in journals as the American Poetry Review, the Iowa Review, the New England Review, the New Yorker, Ploughshares, Poetry Northwest, and Poetry, and have received, among other awards, the Agnes Lynch Starrett Poetry Prize, the Stafford Hall Award for Poetry, the Oregon Book Award, which is the Oregon Book Award, and 2 Pushcart Prizes. She is the co-author with David Trinidad of Holding Our Own, the selected poems of Stafford. She has taught poetry at Lane Community College, Lewis and Clark, and for many years at Reed College. Currently, she teaches privately and lives in Eugene, Oregon. So without any further ado, here is Maxine Scates.
Thank you. It's really, this is a wonderful space. What a terrific space to be able to read in. And so thank you for having me here. I'm wondering, can you hear me okay on the mic? Yeah, you're good? Okay. What I'd like to do is read, I think 4 poems from My Wilderness, which is my most recent book, and then I'd like to do the thing we really like to do, which is read some new poems from a new manuscript. So it's kind of a half and half. But I'll start with the title poem, My Wilderness. I should tell you I live in the woods, which may explain some things about this poem. My wilderness. I tried to grow what others grew, eggplants and zinnias, tomatoes, dahlias, even corn. But there were too many trees, the darkness beneath them, growing mushrooms, fawn lilies, and trillium. As the years I longed for sun passed, and I learned to love the trees. This winter, the day the ice storm came, branches cracked and fell all morning, taking others with them. And in the afternoon, a maple and a cherry fell across the roof. At dusk, when it was over, the owls, 2 and 3 and maybe 4, more than I'd ever heard, echoed the day's losses. But because I live among the trees, my worst dream is of the bulldozers, which will come someday after this hillside has been logged. They'll come the way they did to the old cherry orchard, where every spring someone raked the earth around the still leafless trees, the time lines visible from the road. And then one day I'd round the corner and come upon them, their endless clouds of blossom. It takes so much to turn an orchard into a bare field, ready for a subdivision. Trunks split, stumps chained, wrenched and dragged away, all of it worse than any storm. Because branches gathered for kindling, trees cut and chopped, spring does recover what a month ago seemed broken. The big leaf maples filling in the gaps. If I have to leave here, I'll never live in spring. I won't leave the wisteria dangling outside my window, the globes of rhododendrons out under the firs, suspended like red lanterns in the rain. It takes a long time to learn how to live anywhere. The irises last a season or 2, then dwindle. The daylilies last 20 years before their roots gave way to rot. But the wisteria, the rhododendrons, the maples, firs, and wild cherries reseed themselves. Even the difficult oak keeps growing. And the roses. If I could say what a life is, I'd say roses, how they taught me early of desire, in the way a man bent laying pipe on a Sunday to make a rose garden for his wife, because he couldn't love her any other way. And when the marriage fell to ruin, it was the roses that survived. each bud unfurling through dog and drought. I'd tell how I planted the Abraham Lincoln for my mother because it was her favorite, though as it turned out, I planted it too close to the path, and so she brushed against it every morning as it stood wet with dew. And when she fell and had to leave her home forever, I cut her deep red roses and brought them to her in her hospital bed, and then she did not cry. But those were hybrids, vulnerable to bug and mildew. My roses are old roses. They love the shade. They sprawl over trellises that barely bear their weight. They twine among the trees, blossoming in clusters, tiny and uncuttable, bright beacons in the twilight world under a sky I cannot see for green. They smell of musk, and when I try to train them, they won't mind. Fierce with thorns, they snag my arms, draw blood. And yet I scrape the moss off the flat blue stones that lead to them, as if I were scrubbing the steps of a church or shrine, so I can stand beneath them when they bloom. If I leave here, it will be because I cannot tend what I barely tend now. If I leave, I'll leave in autumn, the rose canes dead, leaves turning yellow. I'll leave the way my mother did, never looking back. I think of this book as a poem that's sort of infused with poems about grief. And the book is dedicated to my mother, and who died at the age of 100 years and 8 days, and my very dear friend Bridget Kelly, who died at 65. So this is a poem that's called Bridge, and it references a film by Hirokazu Koreeda called Afterlife, which, if you've never seen it, I think you can see it on YouTube now, or it's on Criterion too. But it's a wonderful movie that thinks about death in interesting ways. Bridge. Those afternoons, I can only say, as a child's backpack blooming brighter than the others, horse left behind in a trailer kicking slats, sheaths of irises rattling in wind, or yes, the jar of honey falling from my hands in the grocery store, heaviness slipping, glass I couldn't save from breaking, and yet some pleasure in a pound of honey spreading slowly at my feet, gumshoe whose trace remained long after the kid came with his mop. The way that day last fall stays even now, the long climb to the meadow we thought we'd never see again. We were so happy then, dog disappearing into yellow reeds and green pools. On the way down, I stood at the canyon's rim just listening for something to carry me. The stream, a hush, then aspens muttering. In Koreeda's Afterlife, the dead choose one memory to be reenacted before they cross over. One memory holding the weight of all the rest, erasing even itself as it's completed. And when the lights go up, its author's gone. Yet when the living look back, nothing's discreet. Sadness comes not in a single memory, but because we know what happens next. The last words we can't know as last until nothing follows. The pond. The brush conceals it at this time of year, when the red currant and tangle of Nootka Rose begin leaking out. I bring my dog to swim early mornings, cherry blossoms drifting on the surface, before she plunges in. Sometimes she doesn't retrieve all the sticks I throw. Distracted by the croaking of frogs, her nose in the air, she glides to the far side where the trees grow down to the edge. Today it was raining so hard I couldn't see the sticks break the surface. Water and more water as I stood on the bank calling, "Bring it." And when I slipped and fell into the forgiving mud, "Good girl," as she ran to my side. Years ago, I found the pond on a foggy afternoon while following the trails crisscrossing the hillside. Then the narrow path in, the robins fluttering and the cherry and ash on its banks. Years when I lost it, but once I remembered what to look for, I saw how the trees surrounded something, this opening I step into with my aloneness. Now it reminds me of the dream where I knew memory was no longer past. Time was fluid, free-floating, in open space. The pond or a wound, whatever we stand at the edge of, live with. It was an awful winter, but this is the changeable season, the sudden darkening of sky, then the downpour, then the sun. And I'm going to read the last poem from My Wilderness. I was unable to be with my friend when she was dying, but I was very much with my mother when she was dying, and for the 6 months leading to her death. And my mom worked in the library, which is probably the reason I'm standing here. She worked in the LA library system. She went back to work when I was 5. And I was having trouble learning how to read, and she got the children's librarian to send books home that she thought I would be interested in. And then I really learned how to read, and and that was it. Everything changed from that moment. But so I owe a lot to her. Return. I was reading about faith. The author said we return to what we believed in when we were young. But I can say with certainty, I did not believe in a God. Maybe gods, though, the ones I found in the Edith Hamilton mythology my mother gave me when I was a kid. As for return, the word says something about time I don't understand, unless it's the way I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes and staring at my mother's collection of birds and one brass giraffe she bought at the zoo. I wondered if I put away all the things she wanted me to remember by, would I keep remembering? Then I recalled that after she retired, she loved going to the zoo, and how one day when I went with her, we sat on a bench and she reached into her straw bag and gave me a sandwich and an apple. When I was a kid, there was never enough time for just sitting on a bench, eucalyptus rustling overhead, eating our lunch. She was too busy just getting by. But on that bench, it seemed we could return to what we never had and have it, as we did one day in the hospital last winter, while we waited hours for a doctor to come and talk about hospice. Then nothing hurried, and as if we were on that bench again, my mother, growing weightless, tiny as her time was ending, told me how for a quarter she'd flown high above Long Beach in a 2-seat plane 80 years before, and how one day she'd gone to a mortuary with a friend who worked there because she wanted to see a body, and did, and found she was not afraid of what she saw. And though I've often thought she told the same stories over and over, I'd never heard either of these. We talked on, and when I thought to thank her for the mythology, she asked why I liked the Greeks, and by now I know it is because they never die, but live unknown among us. She was quiet then, so I asked if there was anything she wanted to know about what was coming. And she said, "Yes, when will I die?" She knew I couldn't answer, but I told her again there were ways of making dying easier, ways to prepare. And when the doctor did come, she listened and signed the papers, though in the end, I don't know that it was easier. Just a kind of map to follow, what can't be followed, until, as I imagined it, she stepped off a cliff, the way we do in Dream, but this time kept on falling. So, I'm reading this poem by request, and it's a title poem of a new manuscript, and it's called To You. And Bob just asked who the you is, so I will say that the you are people younger than me. To you. I know grief, and you may know it too. But I have reached the age where it is perpetual. I didn't know it would be like this, so I'm telling you, who still have a whole lifetime to forget your grief, the way I forgot Angie, who wore too much eye makeup, whose skirts were too short for a 7th grader, or so the girls' VP said, who did not come to school one Monday, having died over the weekend of spinal meningitis and disappeared from the life she would have lived. Well, I forgot her, as I lived those years she never had, though now she comes back often, looking ahead of her time in her black skirts and torn fishnets. And now, when I do not have my whole lifetime ahead of me, the phone rings, and another has suddenly passed, and she is as young as when I first knew her, before her daughter was murdered, and she took her grief and fought for gun control, and became a counselor, and wrote a play in which time collapsed, and her daughter starred alongside her. And if you think her having done all of that and more makes her death any less sudden, it does not, which is what makes grief perpetual amid our ongoing die-off. Yet I am still here, and this morning I do have more to tell you. Just hours ago, the sun filtered down to the forest floor, finding wet leaves and fir needles and no blackberry vines, because my dog and I had left the trail. She with her 4 good legs, and I with my 1 good one, walking and sliding where only the deer had passed before us. Or how 40 years ago, Bill and I walked every day through the streets of Florence toward the attic we had rented in Pellisguardo, carrying our dinner past Santa Maria del Carmine, where inside Masaccio's man and woman fled paradise forever, trying to hide their terrible shame. We could go in any time we wanted and drop the lira into the slot, bringing light into the medieval darkness, and look upon their misery, their sorrow, as if they might instruct us on what or what not to do as we stumbled through the rest of our lives, where now I remember and return to them, because I do believe memory is a dwelling as singular as any place we've ever lived. Though in LA, the tract where I grew up is a long-term parking lot for LAX, and the hill where my grandparents' house stood among the oil wells is a city park. Which is all to say that some of the places you live now may be erased or resurrected like that park, planted as it is with native plants, because of course it's still your choice, the way it was ours, who failed at doing so much of what we said we'd do, failing you as history has failed all of us. But maybe you'll never find what you are looking for, meaning you'll keep looking, as I was the other night, when I heard the cry of a female great horned owl and looked up as she hooted and flew from treetop to treetop at dusk, and then I did not think of you, I watched her fly. And finally, as for what is coming, there are always signs. Just think of the photo of my parents, divorced early in the Second World War, on the day they remarried, She with her wrist bandage from working a punch press. He with his hands bandaged from shrapnel that lodged in his body for the rest of his life. In the photo, these two people, who are still strangers to me, look almost hopeful. But nothing good will come of it unless I count my own life, born as I was some years later of their second chance union, which took place as if upon an irradiated funeral pyre the day after we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, about which they surely must have known. A lot of these poems in this book are about children, and this poem is about, I can say it because no family members are present. This poem is about my aunt, who, well, the poem will tell you what happened. It's called Untold. As if I was her confessor, she summoned me, and then she told me what was done to her as a child, not once, but again and again, by those she trusted, by the only ones she could trust, who threatened, who told her never to tell. And so she carried her sack of stones alone throughout her long life, among those who had abused her and those who did not know. And I said I was sorry, as if I could make up for no one having ever said they were. And later, I thought she told me because she knew my story, how I'd found others who had helped me, taught me each word is a stitch, holding time, when all her life she had lived outside of time, as if one of Dante's figures bent to the sin which brought them to hell in the first place. Because although she had done nothing wrong, what she did not say had taken on its own life, layers and layers narrowing, twisting, and turning back until she believed all of it was her own doing. She told me this. I think she wanted me to carry what she had always carried for a while. And I did. And now I've laid it down, this stitch that might have been a beginning, though she is gone. I noticed that a number of poems that I'm reading here have horses in them, and so this poem is called Horse. Just right up front, riding the horse, the way kids do. Horse. I was a horse for too long, but I didn't know. I didn't know I shouldn't have been a horse. It felt good. It felt right. The galloping, how I stopped by the river to drink, ate apples only slightly rotten from their tree. I didn't worry about much. I had no saddle. I had no rider. I was a horse galloping the way I see them now in a field, tossing their heads, manes flying, sometimes giving a short buck of joy, and reminding me of how when I stopped being a horse, my days of worry began. I was afraid. The ants were waiting, watching, saying maybe this one or that one will be next, though I could see they couldn't quite choose among us. And still, I thought what took Nana would take me, the drugged monotone, years spent in institutions, low-slung California tile, green grass and picnic tables hiding the horrible wards. And didn't I say very young I would never have children, though I only remembered when I did want them, when I was trying to overturn what I'd already set in place. As for the broken pots, the shards, the clogged watering cans, one ceramic turtle and my mother's St. Francis, whose head is cracked, who is in danger of breaking in two, though I take him in and lay him under the stairs among the boxes every winter. As for the wind chimes and the bell outside my window, the young oak which is growing tall, I am tired about thinking about what happens next. So I think about the horse and what did not happen and what did. Those days in the high country along the river, the broad flat stones shining in the clearest green when we bent our heads to drink, how we crossed the river and muddied the water then. This life. In the novel I'm reading, one asked the other what her happiest day was. It's a good question, and I think it wants me to stop thinking about what will not make me happy. For instance, my mother wanted to be 100 years old, and when she awoke on her 100th birthday, she was happy. And now, when she comes back in dreams, I tell people she's 101 because she lived 8 more days into her 101st year. But I know I'd rather not live that long. No kids, no one to pitch in when the money runs out, though I know having kids is no guarantee of money or even a visit. Last night, I dreamt I was walking along a river, and across the river, a herd of horses ran, manes flying, legs flashing in the early morning sunlight. They made me happy, but then I was afraid I would fall into the river barefooted in my bathrobe. And now the moment of dream happiness has, for a moment, kept me from thinking about how we all hurt each other. Sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly, strewing collateral damage with each choice we make. And maybe the better question is, don't I have what I want? Which is not so much one day of happiness as this life, where Bill sits at the table reading, and when I look up, he's crying because we're listening to late Billie Holiday, the 50s. And maybe he's also remembering the night when he was in college, when he played in a band downstairs while she was singing upstairs. And when their set was over, his band of white college boys went upstairs and stood in the back of the room listening to the great singer sing just a few years before she would die. And though I know it will end quietly one day, what I want is this life. Bill and his tears and our dog and the wild cherry trees blooming as they are now. I don't want to leave this room, the hummingbird at the feeder out the window, my beautiful, sustaining life, which is all anyone wants, which is why, in what they call war, the dictators try to take all of it away. The rooms and tables where people sit down to eat, the birds singing in courtyards, the bakeries and blossoming and song, the parents from the children, and the children from the parents, taking and taking until they believe nothing is left. Are you doing okay for time?
Oh, you're doing great.
Okay. I'm going to read 2 more poems. There's a poem about forgiveness. Because it seemed, as the poem will go on to say, I've always thought, that it was incumbent upon me to forgive people around me. And then I had a kind of a change of thought about how that actually worked, and that's what the poem is trying to deal with. These days, the maples are blooming, everything golden, dusted with pollen. The oak will bloom last. The horse who has followed me for most of my life, a palomino, is here. A golden horse who stood in a shed at the edge of a field, whose vein and trembling flank I touched, whose eyes I looked into, electric as the moment I had imagined our first meeting would be. Yet what else have I learned in the slow time of a lifetime, but that the problem with happiness is that someone will always take it away. Even when I am happy, I am waiting for someone to take it. Only now can I say that when I was a child, I was not there. I thought everything had happened before me and knew how my brother stood in our great-grandmother's garden in Boyle Heights in the middle of the Second World War, her dahlias as tall as he was. No one was paying much attention to him. The dahlias were purple and red, nodding in the heat on that day when I was not yet alive. The other day, flock after flock of robins flew through the woods, winging somewhere to the northeast. Hesiod says it's important to watch for bird signs, and the robins were a sign. Bird after bird stopping to rest on the fir limbs, still trying to follow the route they have always followed. Does Hesiod say we should forget the bad days? Those days when I knew I was wrong, but did not yet know I would wrong others? I don't remember. But he does say those days are filled with noise. I've thought about forgiveness for so long, I thought it was mine to grant, when now I'd say it is mine to ask for, which means I must say I am like those who I believe have wronged me, which means I must see myself as I saw them. And isn't there some pleasure in glimpsing what has always been there, what I never wanted to see? The pulleys cranking with their horrible effort, the mighty ropes beginning to fray, on these days when everything is more dear, these days when I still pull myself back from the flood of losses I'm suddenly desperate to say. And I'll end with this poem called The Song. I had a wonderful teacher in college. Her name was Anne Stanford. I eventually edited her selected poems. It was a state school in California. It was almost free to go to, which was good because I wasn't a very good student most of the time. And she took a bunch of kids probably who'd never seen the inside of a middle-class household that had books in it. You know, it was a house that was lined with books. She did an independent study class she lived in a canyon, Topanga Canyon, I think. And so she took 8 of us up into her house to do an independent study class. And it was transforming. The song. Was it there in the steady beat of the oil well at the top of Toluca Street, whose arm my mother told me she rode as a child, as it chugged up and down, emitting toxic gases, still wafting over us, one Sunday as I danced with my cousin? I was wearing the communion dress I wore to every family gathering for a year since my mother had paid a lot for it and wanted me to get some wear out of it. But if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen a toy gun tucked into the waistband, because I lived on the street of boys, where no, I had not yet heard the song, though the gun does say something about how a girl survived there on that street, where one day my father drove his truck, a Peterbilt, and parked it in front of our house, the truck as long as the house was wide, which reminds me now of Long Meg, a stone longer than she was wide, and her daughters, the other stones in the circle, on an early summer day, years and years in the future, when I climbed over a stile and stepped into the waiting stillness and heard it again when I thought it had left me. But then, on that street, I was still years away from that evening. My teacher played the recording in her living room, where she had invited 6 or 8 of us to write poems and talk about them. Though first she asked us to listen to the whales singing, which I thought odd, given I'd never thought much about whales. Or maybe I did hear it earlier, in high school, when I watched Mr. Novak, a TV show about an English teacher who loved Robert Frost. Or maybe it was Frost himself, the first poet I ever saw, his poem fluttering in the wind and glare until he gave up trying to read and recited another from memory, as along with all the other 6th graders, I watched Kennedy being inaugurated. And though the words meant nothing to me, he wasn't like anyone I'd ever seen, a ragged old man who stood singing what I couldn't quite hear yet, but what I still hear now when all is scattered. The dog with her stitches, the old cat dying, The books being erased from libraries, like the one where my mother worked and brought home the one where my mother worked and brought home the collected frost. The song which begins not so much to cohere as to slow the beat of my blood into some kind of eternal ordering, which holds oil wells and whales and books lost and books waiting to be written. The song I first heard when those whales sang. The gun gone, my father gone, the whales sounding so mournful now, I can't help but think they were singing the end of us, an elegy, even as it seemed the beginning of wanting to make a vessel to hold what was already disappearing as we tried to sing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxine. Wasn't that terrific? So you have 2 books back there. Okay, good. So we're going to take a break, buy some books, and I made a cheesecake. I'm the one that eats cheesecake at my house.
I'm sorry, Mark. It's gone. Very good.
So eat the cheesecake, otherwise I have to eat the cheesecake. We have 2 lists back there to sign up. One is for the open mic and one is for the mailing list. So if you want to be on the mailing list, sign up on that one. If you want to do the open mic, sign up on that one. And we'll take a couple of minutes and come back here for the open mic.